There's no other Marvel character I could write for any length of time. Not coming from a superhero background, I have no attraction to any of those characters. The Punisher was the only one.
Nowadays, Frank Castle is one of the most popular Marvel characters, having been featured in 3 films of varying quality and a very successful Netflix series. But back in 1998, this wasn't the case. The Punisher had hit rock bottom and his comic had been canceled. Needless to say, Frank Castle was in dire need of a hard reset. But first, if you enjoy Behind the Panel, make sure you click and subscribe for past and future episodes. Garth Ennis and the Punisher were a match made in comics heaven. His dark humor and visceral storytelling were the perfect fit for Frank Castle's Punisher, which explains why Ennis has written some of the very best Punisher stories to date. But this perfect pairing did not happen overnight. In 1998, Marvel Knights founders Joe Quesada and Jimmy Palmiotti, who both loved the Punisher, wanted to get him back in a monthly book. But they knew in order to do it, and do it right, they had to find a fresh take on Frank Castle.
At the time, people were looking for something else. We were not going to come back and give you the same old, same old. We had to give you something different, and with that, we definitely gave you something different.
Writer Tom Snigowski pitched the boys a wild idea to cast the Punisher as an angel of vengeance, swapping out guns for supernatural weapons.
You can go back now and read it and get a kind of kick out of it. It is crazy. You know, both Chris and Tom are so talented. They were the right people for the book at the same time, including Bernie, and I'm awfully proud of it.
The angelic Punisher run garnered negative reactions, but it actually helped boost sales. It may be the first time in comics history that hate reading became a thing.
It was a book that, even though people were like, oh, I don't like this, or this is too weird, or everything, it still sold like a monster. The first issue did well, second issue did great, third issue did better than the first issue, and the fourth issue sold more. I think with the Punisher it became, what's going on? This book is insane, and then I have to check it out.
The Marvel Knights team knew Supernatural Punisher was not sustainable, so they already had someone else waiting in the wings to take the book over. Preacher writer Garth Ennis. Palmiotti and Quesada were well aware of Ennis' distaste for superheroes. They knew the Punisher was the only Marvel character Ennis would consider writing.
There's no other Marvel character I could write for any length of time. Not coming from a superhero background, I have no attraction to any of those characters. Some years after all that, I did figure out I could write Nick Fury reasonably well, but at the time the Punisher was the only one. Because the Punisher, of course, resembles a lot of the characters I grew up with in British comics. I was just so busy. When Joe and Jimmy first asked me to do it, I had so much on, and I realized if I take this on now, it's going to be a big mess. That was why you got the sort of Ghostbuster Punisher. As I recall, sold pretty well anyway, I think because people just wanted the Punisher. So it was maybe a nice way to test the waters. And of course, when Stephen, my book, came out, people went crazy for it because it was the Punisher they wanted.
Ennis and artist Steve Dillon's unapologetic take on the Punisher was a gleeful, over-the-top bullet orgy mixed with a dark sense of humor. To Ennis, there was no point in writing Frank Castle as anything but a homicidal lunatic.
In the end of the 90s, I didn't see any particular reason to treat it with any real degree of seriousness. It was a simpler time. It was easy to write a book about a violent character and simply treat it as a ridiculous, ludicrous concept that could almost be played for laughs, which we frequently did. Frank in and of himself is incredibly simple to write, and there's something about that one-note quality of his, that incredibly limited series of responses, that series of dour one-liners that he responds to the world with. Even to this day, I still find quite amusing. So the character in and of himself is very satisfying to write.
The Preacher guys are doing Punisher, what's that like? But I don't think anybody expected so much humor, dark humor in the book, and it was like one of my favorite things that Garth has ever done. He was hitting every little note, and Steve just nailed the faces and the people, and Ganucci and Soap and all these characters.
Coming off the heels of the hyper-violent Preacher, Ennis knew a thing or two about how to push the editorial envelope.
What both Joe and Jimmy did was flag stuff and say, just a heads up, we may not be able to get away with this. Manucci in the hospital bed, the first time you see her without her limbs, butt plug. hanging from the ceiling. This was stuff that they would laugh their asses off at, but they would warn us in advance, I don't think we can do this. The two of them would finesse things a little bit. You know, they would choose the right moment to show it to the publisher or not show it to him at all. They'd learn the tricks of editorial work for Marvel pretty quickly.
For Ennis, Marvel Knight's Punisher introduced him to mainstream comics fans, an audience that may not have known him as the co-creator of Preacher.
I've thought about this, you know, and although I don't regard the Marvel Knight's Punisher as being really as good as the Max Punisher work that I did, as being as worthwhile, I have realised how important it was to me and my career. A lot of people talk about Preacher, but it barely sold half what that Punisher run did. And all of a sudden, I realised what this did for me was it got my work in front of a mainstream Marvel audience who might never go anywhere near something like Preacher. And all of a sudden that audience is seeing the weaponized polar bear, Manucci rolling around on her stumps, Detective Soap and his friend Bud Plug who hangs himself. All this grotesquerie that audience has never really encountered before, at least not in comics. And all of a sudden they're seeing me do this, and it introduces me to them in quite a violent and sudden and shocking way. And I really do think it moved my career up a gear.
Ennis and Dillon's Marvel Knight's Punisher run has become a quintessential Punisher story for fans of the anti-hero. Throughout the years of working together, Ennis and Dillon built a fruitful rapport, but more importantly, became dear friends, until Dillon's unexpected passing in 2016.
We worked together very, very simply. We almost never talked about work, almost no creative interaction. I know that sounds odd, people are surprised, but each of us simply trusted the other to get on with the job. I would supply him with scripts that kept him entertained, that I wouldn't ask him for the impossible, and he would give me good artwork that told the story exactly the way I wanted it, and that's all it took. In the 25 years I knew him, we almost never talked about what we were doing at that particular time. We talked about anything else but. Sometimes he would ask me, just out of interest, what was coming up, you know, what would happen to this character. But it wasn't because he was preparing himself to draw it. He was just interested. As he always said, give me a good story. And that was why he was interested. He wanted to know if the story would continue the way it was going. Would it be good? Would it give him what he wanted? There was never any, can you redraw this? There was never any, you'll need to rewrite this sequence because I can't. That never happened. It was really just a kind of what we call telepathy. It's one of the reasons I was enormously fortunate to know him and work with him.